An average person might ask themselves, why do we need to be reminded so many times about the mitzvah of Ahavat Hager? A regular person says to himself or to herself, what? I'm going to not think about the weaker person in society. I'm going to display some kind of, you may even say, racism against someone who is chosen to join the Jewish people. And in many respects, that is true, meaning the mitzvah of Ahavat Hager is, on a base level, very understandable. It's pashut to most people. We need to look after the weaker elements of our society. It's also understandable why general societies also need to be reminded to look out for the weaker elements, to avoid any kind of favoritism to those who are in a stronger position or come from a particular lineage. And in many ways, the mitzvah is quite straightforward. In this shiur, what we're going to do is we're going to look through some of the sources related to mitzvah Hager, Ahavat Hager, and towards the end, think about another way of framing it, a way which I think actually makes the mitzvah much more relevant, not for general people, but for the most committed people in Am Yisrael, and I'll explain why. Let's spend a few moments going through some of the basic sources in understanding mitzvah Ahavat Hager. The first source on your sheets, Dvarim Yud Yutet, says, "V'ahavtem et hager ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim." The simple meaning is you need to befriend strangers, you need to look after them, because you too were strangers in the land of Mitzrayim, meaning it should be simple to you. Just like you underwent trials and tribulations, you also need to avoid that in an ideal society, a society ruled by Torah and mitzvot. The Netziv, interestingly, says, on source number 2 on your sheets, Ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, harei atem hayom ravei ha'erech, meaning today you are worth a lot. You have great value today. Kach hager hashafel hazeh, mi yodea koch hatzafun bo. So too this ger, this convert or this stranger who is low, who knows what strength is hidden in him and in those who come after him. And so therefore, according to the Netziv, part of the reason we're commanded to love the ger is because just like you in Mitzrayim were shafel, were avadim, and no one really gave you any credence, so too you need to be careful not to just judge people by their station in life, which is actually another way of understanding the mitzvah, not just because you are gerim be'eretz Mitzrayim, but because the gerim themselves have a unique value. If you look at the Malbim, source number 3, he says like this: "V'ahavtem, v'alken, ani metzaveh etchem le'ehov et hager, kedei shetidbeku b'midotai, ki ken nahagti imachem b'yotechem gerim be'eretz Mitzrayim." Meaning, you need to show love to the ger, just like I showed you love. It's not only that you were a ger, so you need to understand what happened. It's also you were a ger who was loved by Kadosh Baruch Hu, who brought you closer to the mitzvah. And so what Kadosh Baruch Hu commands us is to follow him. Just like Hashem was good to you, brought you closer, so too you need to be good to the gerim. And so you get a sense from both of these sources that it's not just about what you experienced. Rather, there's a whole other level that goes into it. Part of that is the hakara, is the recognition that you yourself have value. Just like you want to be perceived as someone of value, so too the gerim, even though they are lowly, so to speak, they also have intrinsic value. Just like in Mitzrayim, you were taken out by HaKadosh Baruch Hu and brought closer to him, we also want to have that experience open for the gerim. Source number 4 on your sheets is the Sefer Chinuch, and he says like this: "HaMitzvah b'kol hasfarim shenitztavenu lehov gerim." We're commanded in all of the books to love the gerim. Klomar shenizhar shelo letzaer otam b'shum davar, meaning we should be careful not to cause them pain in anything, but rather do them good and grant them kindness according to what is proper and is possible. And then he goes on and he explains who the converts are. Converts are anyone who connects with us from the other nations, that leaves his religion, enters into our religion, and about them is stated, you shall love the stranger. And even though the commandment about the Israelite includes him, as it is stated about him, you shall love your neighbors yourself, since behold, the righteous convert is included in your neighbor, God added for us a specific commandment about his love, and so too is the thing in the prevention against cheating him. The translation here isn't great, right? But you see from the Sefer Chinuch that there's a mitzvah to love the ger, which is over and above the mitzvah to love your fellow man. And that is actually an interesting question. Since the ger is someone who's considered part of Am Yisrael, why do we have a special and unique mitzvah, dafka, to love the ger? And he goes on and says, and so too is the thing of prevention against cheating him, and even though he was included in a mansion on Mr. his countryman, Scripture added a specific prevention about him in its stating, you shall not wrong a stranger. And they said in Bava Metzia, the one who wrongs the convert transgresses because of a mansion on his tree, etc., because of you shall not wrong a stranger. And so too with this, he nullifies the commandment, and you shall love your neighbor. And the commandment, you shall love the stranger, meaning someone who does something against Gerim actually violates multiple commandments. It is from the roots of the commandment that God chose Israel to be a holy nation and wanted to give them merit. And therefore, says the Sefer Chinuch, he guided them and commanded them about the ways of grace and compassion and warned them to crown themselves with every beautiful and precious trait to find grace in the eyes of all who see them. And that's really a beautiful sentiment from the Sefer Chinuch. And it ties into what I would say is the very basic understanding of the mitzvah to love the ger, meaning the basic way of understanding is it's just the nice way to be. It's the right way to be. And he goes on, these are the people of the Lord, and it is so much the way of pleasantness and beauty to show kindness and to grant good to one who leaves his people and all the family of the house of his father and mother and comes to take shelter under the wings of a different nation in his love for it, and in his choosing of truth and his hatred for falsehood. Meaning, the Sefer Chinuch takes us back to the very basic understanding, right? Someone who has chosen to put his lot together with Am Yisrael, it is good and right, regardless of his station. It is good, or how he is, or what connections he has. It is good and right to make a special mention, to give him space, and to look after him amongst Am Yisrael. And the Sefer Chinuch adds another interesting facet, which also actually Rav Melamed mentions in his Sefer as well. It says, and I'll read in the Hebrew, and we need to learn from this precious mitzvah, לרחם על אדם שהוא בעיר שאינה ארץ מולדתו ומקום משפחות אבותיו. That we even need to learn from this that anyone who is in a different city where his family isn't to be found, we need to merachem alav. Because if you go according to the Sefer Chinuch's understanding, right, the basic idea of Ahavat Hager is to do the right thing, to do good. And just like it's good to look after a ger, it's also good to look after someone who is in a new town, who is alone. And this is actually important nekuda, which Rav Melamed also brings in terms of olim. Many of us, for those who have the zchut to live in Eretz Yisrael, know the challenge of being an ole. And actually, the mitzvah of Ahavat Hager includes the mitzvah to be careful and mindful of people who are visiting, people who have just moved to a new city, and also people who have made aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. And it all fits perfectly according to Michal Chinuch, because it's a Sefer Chinuch, because it's not tied specifically to a specific thing of the Gerim. It is also, he goes on to say, because you were Gerim in Eretz Yisrael, of course, because it's based in the Psukim, but at the Shoresh for the Sefer Chinuch, you need to look after those who are in a weaker position socially, because that is good and right, and that is the way of Torah. And now we're going to go on and see a little bit more in the Mefarshim and in the Psukim about oppressing the ger. In source number 5 on your sheets, Shmot Kaf Bet, Pasuk Kaf, we read, Ger lo toneh velo telachatzenu ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, meaning you should not oppress or wrong a ger, because you were strangers in the land. And even Ezra says on this, Kasher kebel hager shelo lavod avodat kochavim, לא תונו בארצך, ועבור שיש לך כוח רב ממנו. And I think this is the basic nekuda that we all understand. When someone really puts away avodah zarah and actually takes the difficult journey to leave everything that they know to connect to truth and to leave the entire population of the world almost to connect to Am Yisrael. As we know, historically, the Jews were always a minority, specifically in what they believed. So don't wrong them. It's very easy to wrong them because you have more power than them. You have connections, you have place in society, and because of this, you need to be careful that you don't wrong them. Right, and actually, interestingly, the pasuk that comes after this talks about the yatom and the almana. Even Ezra says, "V'kasher hiskir ger she'en lo koach, kacha yatom v'almana shem Yisraelim ve'en lehem koach." Right, and so he actually says that it seems to suggest that the commandment to not oppress the yatom and the almana stem from the commandment to not oppress the ger. That they come as a secondary concern, really, obviously not secondary, but they come as a result of the ger that is seemingly from all kinds of angles, really in a weak place. Now, the Orach Chaim in source number 7 has something else to say, and it's an interesting point. V'niral lo al piat dama yedua. It seems to be, according to the Dama Yedua, ki nishamot b'nei Yisrael hem shoresh haktusha, that the souls of Bnei Israel come from a source of holiness. The holiness of Bnei Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, right? And in his V'lezeh lo yakpidu b'zizul adam she'enu mihen, and therefore they're not going to be careful about being mezalzel, a person that doesn't come from that shoresh, who doesn't have that almost genealogical connection to Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. ובעונתו לצד שיחשבו שפחות הוא מהדרגות הקדושה ומזה יולד ענפי ההונאה. He says, and therefore it's going to happen that people won't worry about it as much, and that's where you're going to come to wrong them and oppress them. ולזה כאשר ציווה להם לבל יונם ולא ילחצום, אמרתם שאני מצווך לבל תונו, שאין לך למשהו בחינת שורש הרע. So I'm telling you this because you need to know that they are not part of this evil shoresh, right? Once you're talking about olamot of neshamot and kedusha, it is very, very easy almost to fall into the trap of justifying oppressing them, right? And he goes on to say, okay, right? And since you might say that he comes with this klipa, this kind of shell of evilness, even though he has decided to join Am Yisrael, that's why that's why I remind you that you also were gerim beret Mitzrayim. That even though you come from the shoresh hakadosh or the shoresh hakdusha, you too were gerim. You also possibly have this klipa, but I took you out of there. And that is the reason you need to look after the gerim. And the Alshich in source number 8 on your sheets says like this: Al tomar na Yisrael, don't say Israel, im kol kach musa hi avodat kochavim al Hashem hamigane et mi shavda gam achal shenit geir. And he actually points out something very interesting. It could be that someone who converted, he converted, but before he converted, he was involved in avodah zarah. And so it might be the case that people will say to themselves, okay, I'm not going to say anything to him about him now, but I can talk about the evilness of avodah zarah in the past, because avodah zarah is such a serious sin. Obviously, it's against the most basic foundations of Judaism. So of course, I can justify talking badly or even wronging a ger, not because of now, but because of in the past. And then he reminds them, and he says, that's the reason why you were gerim. You shouldn't do it because you're gerim beret Mitzrayim, because over there you also worshipped avodah zarah, right? And I still gave you my Torah. I still brought you out of Egypt. And therefore, it is not good to act that way according to the Alshich and to wrong the Ger. And now let's read the source number 9, Rabbeinu B'chaye, and he says like this: Ger lo toneh bonat dvarim ve'lo terchatzenu b'gzelat mamon. Right, and these are two aspects of this mitzvah, as Chazal discuss. בכמה מקומות כתוב בתורה והזהיר הקדוש ברוך הוא על הגר לפי שהגר הוא מוצא את עצמו יחידי בארץ נוכרייה. So he says, again, kind of returning to what we saw in the Sefer Chinuch, right? The same kind of idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu referred to this mitzvah of Ahavat Hager so many times because hu motzeh atzmo yichidi be'eretz nochriya. He's completely alone in essentially a foreign land, which is actually an interesting way of phrasing it. Normally talk about Eretz Nochriya as a place outside of Eretz Yisrael, a place where non-Jews reside, but he's saying that's how the Ger has to see himself, right? He's in Eretz Nochriya, even though obviously he lives amongst Jews. And he gives a perush on the word Ger, that he's called Ger because he's like Gargir, right? He's like a little seed that is found by himself at the edge of Rosh Nafailan, at the edge of the branch of the tree, which that is a fantastic way of thinking about a Ger, right? You have this entire tree, it's a beautiful image, an entire tree that, different parts of Am Yisrael connect to this tree in different ways. You have like the Talmidei Chachamim that are really in the middle, the Kohanim, and then at the very end, you have this little seed that is hanging by a thread on this tree, and that's the Ger. ומבזים אותו, אומרים לו, על כן אמר השם יתברך, אל תחשוב שאין לו מי שיריב את ריבו. And if you continue to read Rabbeinu B'chaye inside, we don't have too much time, he goes on and explains that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that I will worry for him. And that is actually a very important thing to consider. The Ger, even though he doesn't have very much by way of social connections, he's alone. HaKadosh Baruch Hu worries about the Ger, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take care of the Ger, and you need to be sure to take care of him, because if not, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will hear his prayers and his cries. And one final note from the Torah Tamima on this very important mitzvah, he says there that it is also forbidden for someone to remind about tshuva, and also a ger, and be careful not to say to them, do you remember the maasim of your forefathers, right? Your forefathers were gerim, right? Because actually, and he ends off by saying, afilu ben gerim shekvar nolad biyadut la'aviv, even someone who's already been born into Judaism, and his father was a ger, velo shayach shizkarenu ma'aseh atzmo, lo yamer lo zachor ma'aseh avotecha. You might think, okay, if someone's a ger converted right now, so I'm not going to remind him where he came from, but I can talk to his son about it, and you may even say to yourself, that's like l'shevach. Look what you're doing. You're a Talmid Chacham, and your grandfather wasn't even Jewish. He was worshipping idols. So the Torah says, no, included in this commandment is reminding someone who's Jewish and who's maybe his parents or grandparents converted, that he too comes from that. You're not allowed to do that. You need to be very, very careful and sensitive to the concerns of the Gerim, and even the children and the grandchildren of Gerim. So what we've seen until now is a little bit of a quick run through the basics, if you want to call it like that, of the mitzvah of Ahavat Hager. We've seen that it's tied to our experience in Mitzrayim. It's not only, like the Sefer Chinuch suggested, tied to just doing the right thing by people who are weaker than us. It's actually tied to other things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu brought us out of Mitzrayim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us credence, that He loved us, He brought us closer. It's tied to concerns that, the Ger brings with him such special traits that you don't know what's actually going to develop out of him and his children. And there's a lot more to be spoken about in terms of the yachas of Chazal to Gerim, And there is a murkavut there. But what I want to focus on now is a slightly different way of thinking about it. Because if you remember when I opened, I said that that the average person understands Ahavat Hager so much that it kind of becomes not irrelevant, but it's just an understandable mitzvah, right? And they ask themselves, how could it ever be that I may act this way, or communities may act this way? It's so kind of obvious and simple. I will just say on the side that oftentimes people who are part of a community, and I can share this from my own perspective as someone who's made aliyah, and Rav Melamed writes this in his sefer, that oftentimes the person who is not a ger, who is not the immigrant, or is not new to a town, it's not that they intend to do anything wrong. It's just that it's not part of their frame of reference, right? It's just not part of, they don't really understand, right? They don't really understand what it means to be like, the Rabbeinu Bachaya said, the seed at the end of a branch. And that's perhaps another reason to think about why we're commanded so many times to look after the ger, because even though it is so pashut, it actually can fall by the wayside inadvertently. But I want to suggest another reason, or another conceptual framework for thinking about it. And it ties to the very foundations of what Judaism is about. I would suggest that, and I'm not the only one, obviously, to suggest this, that Judaism at its base works on a tension between particularism and universalism. If you look at source number 11, Shmot Yutet, it says like this: Atem Shmot Yishmu Bekoli V'Shmatem Et Briti Veitem Liskula Mikol Ha'amim Ki Li Kol Haaretz. Now then, if you will obey me faithfully, keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples. Indeed, all the earth is mine. Vatem Tiyu Li Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. You are going to be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? And this is really at Ma'amad Har Sinai, when we are given the Torah, we enter into a covenant with Kadosh Baruch Hu. At the base, our experience is one of a people, a nation, who underwent trials and tribulations in Mitzrayim, who received the Torah as a nation. We are Bnei Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, right? We are, the story of Bereshit is framed as a family. And that is very, very important and essential to Judaism. This idea that it is about a particularism, a way of relating to the world through the prism of a family and as a nation. And you see this in so many different places, right? That there is something intrinsically particular about our approach. But if you look at source number 12, the Bavli in Nadarim talks about this, right? And I'm not going to read it inside because we don't have that much time, right? That if it weren't for the Torah, heaven and earth would not have been established. Meaning the Torah, the thing we receive from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is on one hand tied to the universal picture, the world, but it takes place through the particular, through the way that we learn Torah. And so even there, in that source, you have a little bit of the sense of tension, but it's overwhelmingly particular. Our Torah provides for the entire world. Now, I will just say, and we're going to read another couple of sources in this realm. Hidden there is also a concern for the world. It's also the Torah study that preserves the entire world, and therefore is also talking at some level about the universal. And if you look at the next source number 13, it's interesting the machloket about a goy who learns Torah, whether they get the death penalty or not get the death penalty. There's essentially an opinion that suggests that in the name of Rabbi Meir, that even a goy that learns Torah is like the Kohen HaGadol, right? That goyim can engage in Torah because Torah perhaps has that universal side. At the end, the Gemara talks about it in terms of the Shiva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, but even there you see that even within the very particular framework that we're in with Torah study, even the non-Jews have an element of Torah study tied to the Shiva mitzvot b'nei Noach. And so what I mean by these sources, I mean to suggest that there's always some kind of tension within the Torah that sees Judaism and Torah as both particular and universal. In fact, in many ways, the approach of Christianity to this question is an outgrowth of that tension that is inherent to the Torah, lahavdil, right? They took it to a much more universal place, and we maintain this kind of very tight, particular universal dynamic. And of course, the sources here are plentiful. You can see source number 14 in Micha, this image at the end of days of all the goyim who are coming and going to Har Hashem and to Beit Elokei Yaakov, and you see that part of the tfisa of our Masorah is that at the end of days, Torah has a universal message. Torah is for everyone. It might not be that everyone will join Am Yisrael in that way, but there's a universal aspect to our Torah. And if you look at source number 16, just to take it to the other direction in terms of being much more particularist, in Ezra Tet, where it talks about the separation of people who intermarried, I've highlighted there the source, right? And this is actually one of the first places we see this kind of language in this way in Tanakh. כי נשאו מבנותיהם להם ולבניהם והתערבו זרע HaKodesh ba'amei haratzot. This idea of a holy seed. Now, if you're talking about holy seeds, that is necessarily very particular, tied to genealogy, tied to family, and in many ways is metzamtzem, and perhaps rightfully so, the Jewish story to those who are familiarly tied. And so again, you see throughout that there are these kinds of tensions within the Jewish story. And just to finish off, I'll bring Rabbi Sachs Zatzal and what he says. And he says like this: the structure of the Hebrew Bible is unusual and significant. Its subject is the people of Israel, the descendants of Avram and Sarah. Yet the Torah does not start with Avram. It begins instead with universal archetypes of humanity as a whole. We read about Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah and the flood, Babel and its builders. None of these is a Jew, a Hebrew, an Israelite. They are us in our universality, temptation and sin, sibling rivalry and violence, hubris and the desire for godlike powers. Only after this prologue does the Torah narrow its focus to one man, one family, eventually one nation, and its highly specific destiny. The Torah is a particular text, but it begins with the universals of the human condition. What is absolutely clear is that Genesis tells the story not of one covenant, but of two. The first with Noah after the flood applies to all humanity. The second with Avram and his descendants does not. It is the covenant of one people, the people with whom God, many centuries later at Har Sinai, makes a more highly articulated covenant of Sinai with its 613 commandments. Judaism is built on a dual structure. It is a universal dimension and a particularistic one, neither of which negates the other. God has a general relationship with all humanity, in particular relationship with the children of Israel. Rabbi Akiva expressed this simply and beautifully in his statement in Ethics of the Fathers, in Pirkei Avot. Beloved is humanity, for it was created in God's image. Beloved are Israel, for they are called God's children. And so what Rabbi Sachs picks up on here is that the entire framework of the Torah also combines this universal and this particularistic traits. And so how do I believe this applies to the question of the mitzvah of Ahavat Gerim? The question of the position of the ger and our relationship to him ties exactly to this tension inherent in Judaism, because the ger in many respects is exactly at the tefer, exactly at the seam line of this question. Is the ger sincere? Is he really joining us? Does he really want to be part of Am Yisrael, or does she really want to be part of Am Yisrael? Is the ger an outsider? Is he an insider? Do you remind him where he comes from? Or do you say, no, he's really just part of us? And I think part of the reason, in addition to everything we've seen, the Torah is so insistent on reminding us about Ahavat Hager and Kabbalat Hager is because a people who has a mission, a particularistic mission that is also universalistic in its reach, is very much at risk of looking at the Ger and saying, they're not part of our mission initially, at least, or they're not intrinsically particularistic enough, right? They come from outside. The nekudah of the Ger threatens perhaps the feeling of our intrinsic particularistic message. And that is part of the reason I believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us so many times to be cognizant of the Ger, to be aware of the Ger, to worry about the Ger, because it's dafka those who are most committed to this ideal of redeeming the entire world, but through a particularistic familial group, who are at risk of thinking of the Ger as something else in other terms. And we need to be reminded that is not the case. If you look at the Gemara in Kritut, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi says that we derive the korbanot of the Ger from, and actually all of the elements of Giur and what's required for Giur, from what happened when we entered the covenant at Har Sinai. Meaning we were also not only Gerim in Eretz Mitzrayim, but we were Gerim in our essence, right? That's what we went through. We went through a Giur. We need to be reminded of that just like there is a particular group now that is out for a universal message, that group did not start off that way. It needed to be formed at Har Sinai, even though most of the people who came to Har Sinai were descendants of a familial group. And just to end, I've brought here, and we're not going to read all of it, but the words of the Rambam, famous Igeret to Ovadia Hager, who asked a question similar to this, but you again sense in the Rambam in his answer kind of what I'm talking about. Thus says Moshe, the son of Rabbi Maimon, one of the exiles from Yerushalayim, who lived in Spain. I received the question of Master Ovadia, the wise and learned proselyte. May the Lord reward him for his work. May a perfect recompense be bestowed upon him by the Lord of Israel, under whose wings he has sought cover. You ask me if you too are allowed to say in the blessings and prayers you offer alone or in the congregation, our God and God of our fathers, you have sanctified us through your commandments. You have separated us. You have chosen us. You have inherited us. You have brought us out of the land of Egypt. You have worked miracles for our fathers, and more of this kind. Right? So the question that Ovadia Hager had was, can I be included in the us, in the particular? And I will just say it's such a, perhaps firstly he encountered some kind of comments from people. You can't say us, right? Which actually goes against many of the commentators we saw earlier. But at a very simple level, anyone who's worked with Gerim and knows that they're concerned about these things because they want to do the right thing. They've joined Am Yisrael for the very, very basic reason of doing emet in the world. And they're asking this question not just to make sure they're doing the right thing. They're even happy to exclude themselves from the us because they're so interested in connecting to truth. And he answers like this, Rambam. Yes, you may say all this in the prescribed order, not change it in the least. In the same way as every Jew by birth says his blessing and prayer, you too shall bless and pray alike, whether you are alone or pray in the congregation. The reason for this is that Avram our father taught the people, opened their minds, and revealed to them the true faith and the unity of God. He rejected the idols and abolished the adoration. He brought many children under the wings of the divine presence. He gave them counsel and advice and ordered his sons and members of his household after him to keep the ways of the Lord forever, as it is written, etc. And the Rambam goes on. Ever since then, whoever adopts Judaism and confesses the unity of the divine name, as it is prescribed in the Torah, is counted among the disciples of Avram our father, peace be with him. These men are Avram's household, and he it is who converted them to righteousness. In the same way as he converted his contemporaries through his words and teachings, he converts future generations through the testament he left to his children and household after him. Thus, Avram, our father, peace be with him, is the father of his pious posterity who keeps his ways, and the father of his disciples and of all proselytes who adopt Judaism. And so what Rambam taps into here is he says, yes, you are essentially included amongst the particular. Just like you say that Avram is your father, he's the father of everyone. Because anyone who adopts Judaism be'emet becomes, perhaps even mystically, tied to the Jewish people, tied to the particular, and that is how we are going to achieve the universal. And my hope, B'ezras Hashem, from everything we've seen, is to think about our own relationship to these kinds of questions, to Gerim. Because I think many of us, particularly the most committed, understand the necessity to look after Gerim, but also can understand perhaps what I'm talking about, that the Ger in some way can threaten the very particularistic message of Judaism. I mean, that way actually threaten the more universal message of Judaism, and that is why we need HaKadosh Baruch Hu to remind us to look after the Ger, to remind us that he looks after the Gerim, right? To essentially teach us that the Gerim are part of Am Yisrael, a part of our people, and we need to look after them, make sure they're taken care of. Thank you very much.